And as Commander-in-Chief, I have determined that it is in our vital national interest to send an additional 30,000 U.S. troops to Afghanistan. After 18 months, our troops will begin to come home.
Good evening and welcome to Pull. A U.S. public opinion poll taken in December by the Pew Research Center for the People and the Press reported that 51% of Americans favor President Obama's plans to send 30,000 more troops to Afghanistan. That same poll reported that only 36% of Americans say Obama has a clear plan to bring the situation to a successful conclusion. Tonight, we'll look at how these poll numbers affect presidential decision-making, and we'll talk with a leading journalist about the role of media in shaping the American public's understanding and opinion of the war in Afghanistan. Joining me are Carol Doherty, the Associate Director at the Pew Research Center for People and the Press, where he writes and edits the center's reports on public opinion and America's news coverage. David Mark, currently the Senior Editor for Politico, a magazine and website covering American politics and campaigns. And Gail Lamont, a journalist who has written for leading newspapers such as the New York Times Global Edition, the Financial Times, and the Christian Science Monitor, covering female entrepreneurs in post-conflict environments like Afghanistan. Welcome to all of you.
Good to be here.
Thank you. David, President Obama is still at the beginning of his presidency, and he's still trying to balance, meeting his domestic agenda. How is that affecting his strategy in Afghanistan?
The problem for the president is a lot of his supporters did not back him to be a war president. They heard the president, the then candidate's vocal criticism of the war in Iraq. They thought it was going to be the same thing in Afghanistan. He was going to pull back troops. If you listen to what Obama actually said on the campaign trail, he talked about Afghanistan as being the epicenter of the war on terror. He even went so far as to suggest Pakistan could be a target for military action. So in a way, he's not really shifting his views that much. He's just kind of following through it. He probably is sending more military troops than many had expected, but I think any president put in that position would probably do the same thing.
Carol, the American public opinion of the war in Afghanistan is now becoming more important. The politicians want to know what the people are thinking. From the recent polls that have been conducted, what are the American people seeing as success in Afghanistan?
Well, I mean, as you say, a thin majority approved of the troop increase. I think that's an important marker. It's in contrast to President Bush's strategy in Iraq a couple of years ago, where there was a lot of skepticism. So he's getting fairly good marks there. In fact, his approval rating on Afghanistan a lot higher than on domestic issues at this point. He's doing relatively well. When they define success, they mean defeating the insurgency. I mean, at this point, the public wants the insurgency defeated, and obviously minimal loss of life for U.S. forces over there.
And what about the whole concept of helping rebuild Afghanistan? Is that important to the American people?
That's frankly a lower priority for the American public. I mean, most of the public sees this in terms of security of the United States first and foremost.
And the levels of troops and how many casualties perhaps that we're seeing.
Right, absolutely.
Gail, I want to bring you in. You're a journalist that you've gone to Afghanistan and you've covered various issues. Do you think that the media is doing a good enough job of covering the news there so that the American public can be informed to, make those decisions on these polls?
Well, I think you have to see it through the lens that you're just talking about how the American public views this war primarily, right? Through the lens of troop levels, casualties, and security. I think that there is enormous pressure on reporters to do embed stories, to get in and get out. So you do see a lot of military coverage, and perhaps less, except for some of the major papers and the Associated Press, who can do the features about what daily life is like, and the fact that daily life goes on in Afghanistan in a very real way, despite all of the fighting that's going on around them.
Do you think that most of the media organizations have enough people on the ground to really capture the stories?
I think you've seen a shift, probably with the incoming administration and with the discussion turning much more to Afghanistan as Iraq scales down in terms of troop levels. You have seen a shift in terms of, some of the most reputable, most best-known news organizations putting incredible resources on the ground in Afghanistan. But it remains a challenge because you're in an era where American newsrooms are scaling back. And that is very hard because it's expensive to cover international stories and particularly expensive to cover war. So I think that you see a real challenge for news organizations to invest all the resources they want and that they believe the story demands.
Carol, what are the recent trends that you're seeing from the polls that are being taken of American public opinion of the war in Afghanistan?
Well, what you saw was a decline in support. People saw things, more and more Americans said things were going badly over there throughout 2009. There was a great deal of pressure on President Obama to come up with a new plan for Afghanistan. Then you see the plan in December, and the public opinion, 59% still say there's a possibility of a successful outcome in Afghanistan. They're not entirely pessimistic in the way we saw the bottom fall out of support for the war in Iraq and the 2007 period. So I think in some ways Obama's plan has helped stabilize American public opinion.
David, speaking of the president's new strategy that he announced in a military center in December, do you think that through that announcement he was able to gain the American support for sending more troops?
I think he made the best pitch for it. I think those who were not likely to support him probably did not have their minds changed, and that's troubling for the president because that represents a big part of his political base. There's a wing, the left-end wing of the Democratic Party is wholly unsupportive of sending troops there. There's probably 50 to 60 members of the House of Representatives who want to pull out troops now and pull out any funding for troops there. That's not enough to actually get that passed. But it's a big problem that those critics are coming from his own political supporters, not from Republicans.
And David, you were talking about, the elements of this strategy. It's not just the troop levels, but there's other things that, are planned. Do you think that President Obama was able to convince the American people? I mean, he's believed the war has been underfunded and under-resourced from the beginning. Do you think he made that point effectively to the American people?
I think if he focuses on the military element, he's on much more solid ground than the sort of nation-building element, even if that kind of goes hand in hand with each other. I still think a majority of Americans want to do what needs to be done there. People still see Afghanistan as the epicenter from where the 9/11 attacks were launched, and there still is that support. If you start broadening out the mission and starting to turn the country into a Western-style democracy, there's a lot less appetite for that. We've seen how that's gone before. We've seen what happened with imperial powers in the past in that region, and I think support would dip significantly, and the president realizes that.
More on the American reaction to the Obama administration's new strategy when we return. Continuing our conversation with Gail Lamont, Carol Doherty, and David Mark. Gail, I want to ask you, as a journalist, you've gone to Afghanistan and you've actually worked with local journalists. To what extent do American media organizations rely on Afghans to help provide information?
I think that there's no question that in Afghanistan, and as in other difficult regions, that for security reasons and also for the fact that local journalists really do have the language skills, the cultural knowledge, the background, the reporting abilities that are needed for these kinds of environments, that they certainly do represent a critical part of any kind of journalistic team. There is no way to report on your own as a Westerner in Afghanistan. It's just not an environment that's conducive to that for all kinds of reasons, including security.
David, I want to come back to you. Within the strategy of sending more troops was a strategy of when to start the withdrawal timeline.
Right.
And it said that in 2011, in the summer sometime, this would start. Do you think that's a realistic strategy?
The president and his administration have kind of put themselves on the line. Once you set these dates, it's very hard to pull out from that. In a sense, it is realistic. We saw it in Afghanistan. They set a troop withdrawal date. In fact, that was the Bush administration toward the end of its term in office. They set this troop withdrawal date, and it seems to be going on course. The president was very careful to leave some wiggle room to say, yes, we're going to pull out the majority of our troops there. From Afghanistan, excuse me, but military bases will still be there. And under certain scenarios, there still could be tens of thousands. So no president is going to say, we're getting every last troop out by X date, because that would be seen as inviting a target for the terrorists.
And Gail, do you think there's been too much emphasis on the number of troops and not other parts of the strategy?
I think when people see the stories, they do have a real impact on the American public. I think the American public reacts to such stories in which it's clear how much change is happening on the ground.
And you just covered a story about an Afghan victim of domestic violence. Can you tell us about that?
Sure, and I think this is a story where a lot of people were moved, and it also showed the importance of having international forces there. So from the perspective particularly of this organization, there was a young woman who was sold into marriage and was maimed by her in-laws. And they were from a family that was in a very traditional rural region, and she had her nose and ears cut up. And there was, her father took her to an American base to get her treated medically. And she's now within a shelter in Afghanistan, and, you know, doing remarkably well considering what she has experienced and endured. And I think what that shows is also, first, the fact that the Americans were there for her father to take her to get this kind of treatment. Secondly, that there was a network which has been set up in the past 7 to 8 years of domestic shelters, of the women's ministry, of the police, actually now working very effectively with a number of women's organizations when you have such cases to get women into a system where they can get assistance. So I think that you see both the limitations and the real promise of having these kinds of networks. And when that story ran, you know, there's been a great deal of, you know, reaction and discussion about it from people who are really moved.
Carol, do your surveys cover issues like that, like trying to gauge what the American people feel about what the Afghan people are going through? Well,
I mean, there's some of that. The American people certainly have a great deal of empathy there. But again, I mean, the primary consideration is security. I mean, that's the bottom line for the, you know, we took a poll a couple of months ago, general global issues. There's been a rise of isolationism, a sharp rise in isolationism, probably as a result of the economic downturn. So,
and what do you mean by isolationism?
Looking homeward, saying take care of domestic needs first, rather than international affairs needs.
So, David, would you say that the U.S. domestic economy is, you know, affecting how the U.S. public opinion is about Afghanistan?
Sure, there's a long history of this going back to the Great Depression, when right before World War II we saw this, and this happens whenever times get tough economically. Also, I think the way the Obama administration has framed the Afghanistan issue is somewhat different from the Bush administration. That had more of a moral component to it, that not only do we have to prevent terrorist attacks, but we have to spread democracy there. President Obama has spoken very little of that. It's strictly utilitarian. It's for the purpose of defending America in the president's rhetoric. And I think that's affected the public's views as well.
Well, I think what's interesting about that is at the same time that you haven't heard much discussion, you have Ambassador Holbrooke really beefing up the U.S. civilian presence there. So they may not be talking about it, but this civilian surge is going on amid large, you know, public indifference to concern, and in an administration which has talked very little about development, about women, about, you know, what the civilian surge means. And that to me is really interesting on the ground to see the difference between the dialogue and what's actually happening.
What do you think is the most interesting finding of your organization's recent poll on Afghanistan?
Well, I think that President Obama's approval rating has come up in the months since he announced the troop increase. I think that more people see things going better over there. So, I mean, I think on balance, things are going about as well for President Obama from a public opinion standpoint as could be expected.
So there's actually been a shift from the summer when the approval ratings
Right.
went down to
Right.
after the strategy was announced, it has gone up?
It's gone up, that's right. It's in our latest poll, that's right.
Gail, are there any stories that you think are underreported, or that you have wanted to cover but haven't been able to?
You know, I have the luxury of being able to cover a very specific issue about economic development and what things are like in terms of the climate for entrepreneurship, the climate for women-owned businesses, but also the broader business climate, and looking at the challenges of doing real economic development in a region that is extremely troubled and that is still experiencing great violence. But I think it's challenging to find space and time, more importantly time, for a lot of reporters, a lot of terrific reporters who are on the ground, because there is simply too much in terms of the daily exchange on the military side. And every time there is a casualty, for good reason, a lot of reporters must focus on that and must find out what the security story is first because of their audiences. So I think what I find is so interesting is when I come back, people always say, and I've gotten a number of emails from readers saying, you know, we didn't know that this and this goes on. I mean, daily life goes on in a very real way across Afghanistan. And it is sometimes hard when you read the coverage here to remember that.
More on U.S. media coverage of the war when we come back. Back with David Mark, Gail Lamont, and Carol Doherty. David, the Republican Party was seen as the one who supported increased troop levels, but here you had the Democrats who actually backed the president in making this pretty significant decision. How do you think President Obama has balanced these two groups so far, and how do you think this is impacting his domestic strategy?
It's an ongoing challenge for the president. It's somewhat ironic that a lot of his support actually is coming from Republicans in Congress as much as probably a lot more so than Democrats. This is one area where there's not this even partisan split. As I was mentioning earlier, the president has a growing problem on his hands in that the Democratic majorities in Congress generally are not very supportive of sending more troops to Afghanistan. The House Speaker, Nancy Pelosi, said at one point there's no real appetite for doing so. The Democrats in Congress very much want to focus on health care, other matters of domestic spending. So I think this is going to be a big headache for the president going forward.
And, you know, there were a lot of actual peace organizations around the country who actually protested this troop increase and were lobbying Congress against it. How much more time do you think the Democrats have to keep supporting this troop increase before they lose American public opinion?
As long as there aren't mass casualties over there, I still think public opinion will hold up. I still think people see the Afghanistan buildup, troop presence, as a response to 9/11. Fair or not, good or bad, right or wrong, that's how people see it. Those who lived through 9/11 still say those are where the attacks came from. That's where we need to keep our focus on. But if it's open-ended, if the president is not careful about defining the war and what constitutes victory, and he does go past that July 2011 deadline, that's troublesome for him.
Carol, will your organization be doing any polls this year on issues related to Afghanistan?
We'll be continuing to poll on it. Just to address one of David's points, when we asked our initial questions after the president's policy, 71% of conservative Republicans supported the troop increase. 42% of liberal Democrats supported it, and that gap shows the problems that he's talking about within his own party, and that's something we really need to watch as we go forward.
What are any other of the issues that you might be covering besides the troop increases?
We'll ask how people think things are going, where they're getting their news on Afghanistan, and we'll also be tracking the amount of news coverage on a weekly basis.
Gail, I mean, you're in tune with what the American public is reading about Afghanistan. You're writing about the country frequently. How long do you think President Obama has, in terms of what the American people are seeing as success? We talked about casualties, and if we don't see large numbers, we see that as success if we're beating the insurgency. But also some Americans maybe do want to see the U.S. playing a greater role in rebuilding Afghanistan. What do you think Americans define as success from the writing and work that you've done?
Well, I think that they're sort of waiting on the president to help them outline a vision of what success is. And I think for me what's interesting is to see the difference between what's happening on the ground and what's being discussed in Washington. So you have this discussion about a civilian surge on the ground. And you also have a great number of folks in the media and also on the ground there who will say very much on background and sometimes off the record that no one can imagine a 2011 beginning of the scale down. I mean, maybe it's 10,000, maybe it's 15, but
so people are not really buying
people
that.
do not, and these are the people covering this conflict are saying, how do you really get there? And I would say, as someone who used to cover domestic politics, you see in the president's budget numbers are showing a 2011 scale down, and you wonder how realistic any of these numbers are going to be by the time this is all over. So I think people are really waiting among the American public on a real sense of vision of where is this going.
Carol, Gail mentioned, opinion in Washington versus in other places. Has your poll looked at any difference between what Americans in the heartland are thinking versus in the urban areas?
Well, I mean, most of the differences in public opinion are partisan these days, and that's what we see on Afghanistan.
Partisan being between the two major parties,
between Republicans and Democrats. And that's what we see in this case, only we don't see it in the typical fashion, where in this case Republicans are more supportive than Democrats.
And David, do you think that the Democratic Party, I mean, given that there is this schism in terms of supporting increased troop levels because it is taking a lot of money away from domestic issues, how important is that for the constituents here, these funding issues?
It's a big deal. You get this interesting breakdown where it used to be the liberal Democrats who were viewed as kind of the fuzzy-headed idealist abroad who wanted to go impose democracy abroad, and the Republicans were the hard-headed realists who acted strictly in the nation's interests. Now you get kind of an inverse of that, and I think that's directly affecting domestic priorities at home.
And Gail, as a journalist, what kinds of issues do you think that media in America should be looking at this coming year and until next year when all these important decisions have to be made so that the American public can be better informed?
Well, I would definitely not presume to tell other reporters what to cover, but I think in the storm, there's your earlier question about what's underreported. I think what is actually happening in people's lives on a very regular basis is underreported in Afghanistan. And I think it's for all manners of stories and for all manners of reasons, including the fact that there just isn't time in a lot of reporters' days to get everything they want to do done. I'd say that the biggest obstacle is really you have a lot of people who come in and then come out and then come back Afghanistan experts. And that it becomes the joke around the press corps which is living in Afghanistan, right? And so I think really we could do a better job in the American media of really having a foundation.
You know, one issue that I thought received a lot of coverage was the presidential elections in Afghanistan. David, what do you think the recent election with the problems with fraud, how do you think that impacted U.S. opinion of what's going on in Afghanistan?
It probably made the American public a lot more doubtful of it. It's interesting that international pressure seemed to really affect the outcome, or at least call for a revote, and it directly affected the processes by which the Afghanistan elections were held. I think it has a lot of people really doubting the Karzai government and how long that should be backed for. There's been a lot of these leaders over the years that the U.S. has backed in various countries where they were friendly to a point, then they didn't serve our purposes anymore, and we jettisoned them and went to somebody else, and I think people are expecting that.
Yeah, what do you think?
Well, I think that's right. And I think for a while, you know, in 2008 and 2009, you didn't see that many corruption stories, right? So toward the middle to end of 2009, you started to see a whole slew of them come out, which I think has also changed the American public's perception of what is actually going on in Afghanistan.
Carol, you know, as someone who's working in an organization doing polls, do you think this problem with fraud in the Afghan election shifted a public opinion here?
I think it had an effect, clearly, because, you know, of the money and resources that the United States is devoting over there. It can't help but, and it's a story to watch as we go forward.
Carol, I want to ask you, you know, as the last question here, you know, the Afghan people are sitting here watching this.
Right.
You know, increasingly they've been polled on various issues, but they may not understand how polls in the U.S. affect U.S. foreign policy. Can you give us a little bit of information of how polls are used in that respect?
Well, I mean, the American public isn't attuned to everything that's going on in Afghanistan or around the world. I mean, they're famously kind of out of touch often about world developments. But it does, you know, when they do lock in, they lock in a big way.
You mean lock in their opinion?
Yeah, lock in their views. And when they do focus, you know, then it can change things. And I think what we've seen over the last year is how public opinion can affect decision making, because we saw Obama losing support and then, you know, reacting to where the public was to an extent, and now changing up his strategy, and that's had an effect on opinion.
So Afghans can better understand this. Politicians, leaders in the U.S. are looking at these poll numbers. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
My thanks to Gail Lamont, David Mark, and Carol Doherty. We'd love to hear what you think about this or any other poll program. Just go online to aamtv.tv or visit us at tolo.tv. See you next week for another edition of Poll.